Conversations for change, because the world is ready. This thing called awakening. I was looking back over my life the other day with a friend. We were talking about what these experiences are that people call awakening. We were talking about the changes in perspective, physical symptoms, the crises that come up in life, the experiences that tend to precipitate these periods in our life where we suddenly are in a quote-unquote awakening moment or series of events. It brought me back to sometime in the 1990s and reading Caroline Myss when she was talking about these experiences where you suddenly lose your job or your relationship disintegrates or any number of these sort of crisis moments in life, and how these crisis moments in life are always a beckoning from your larger self to find your way back to your own path and to let go of something that is not serving you. And often that's a very difficult thing for us to reconcile, because not serving us in what way really becomes the question we have to go deeper on. Because quite often those jobs we lose are lucrative. Those relationships that blow up were comfortable, but they weren't challenging us. They weren't helping us to grow. They were allowing us, in fact, to slide backwards into habits and patterns that let us stay asleep, that let us avoid rather than confront whatever the inner mechanisms were or are that are attempting to wake us up, that are attempting to get our attention and remind us of that little person inside of us who wants so desperately to be creative and free and experience what it is to be here in the world and alive. Not to conform to the outer structure, not to be yet another factory worker, not to be yet another computer programmer, but to be the most wildly creative and deeply introspective version of ourselves, to find the God inside of us. And in a sense, I guess that's what all of this inner work comes down to. So when we talk about absolute freedom and total responsibility, for example, what are we talking about? We're talking about the same thing. We're talking about the sovereign position that what I determine from within me, inside my own inner experience, has the highest value for my understanding, for my becoming. It doesn't help me to get somebody else's perspective. It doesn't mean that other people's perspectives can't inform us, but it does mean that those perspectives must also be as unique and as internally guided as the one we are on the path of discovering, in order for them to be useful to us. It's interesting to me to look around at the world right now and see how many people are talking about this awakening idea, and go back over the decades of my own life before these were common jargon words, before people were talking this way, and realize that all of this is describing the uncovering of the true self. That's really what it is. And whether it's happening to you as the result of a crisis in your life or an experience that you can't explain, or some dramatic emotional event, or some epiphany, or internal revelation, whatever the driver is, the direction and the result of where it's taking us is always the same. It's always back to the inner world. It's always back inside ourselves. It's the esoteric journey, which is why all of the major religions of the world shun the esoteric journey, because you're not supposed to be getting your answers inside your own being. You're supposed to be getting your answers from the church, the synagogue, the mosque, the priest, the preacher, the minister, the director of your religious experience from the external point of view, from the external position, which is why the Catholic priests to this day will tell you that yes, many people try to find God by going within, but it's not safe. The only true path to heaven is through the church, is through attending Mass every Sunday. This is a powerful statement, and it's a powerful place to land, to become aware in a larger perspective as an individual that this really is the doctrine of all of the religious structures in our world, other than those of the indigenous or those of the spiritualists. Everybody else has to go outside of themselves within the structure in order to be saved. So this mass awakening, as we hear it spoken of on the planet today, is really almost a backlash to that thousands of years of doctrine refusing to admit or to accept or to allow the individual to find his or her own path to God. And yet, of course, all of the major teachers across all religions tell us that that is the only way. The only path to God is within. It's interesting. Because I grew up without a lot of religious influence, I had brothers in the choir at church. I wasn't in the choir. We went to church when the choir was singing on special occasions. I didn't go to church as a regular thing. I never received those doctrines directly as a child. And so I didn't have the framework that suggested that I had to go look outside of myself to find my way. And maybe that's what made it easier for me when I did find the whole exploration of consciousness as the path that I came across in my late teens, to explore that path without any reservation. I had no sense of wrongdoing. I had no sense that I was committing a sin by following my own path, because I hadn't been raised with that kind of doctrine. And so I was free to go about my business of exploring, which I certainly did. But I also look at the people around me, and I see that some of those who had that religious background had something that I didn't have, which was a very direct sense that there was such a thing as a spiritual life that they could lean into, that they could find their way through the exploration of. I had nature. and I had my own inner landscape. And because I've always been a creative musician and songwriter, I was always able to have a direct connection to my intuitive being through that outlet, even though I didn't understand it for decades, that was what it was that I had, or how I was using it and what it was doing for me. But I didn't have any sense of like a personal connection to God, or a relationship with Jesus Christ, or the Buddha, or Lakshmi, or any of a vast number of ascended masters and beings that I'm aware of today. I was raised in the world of the intellectual, rational mind. I had great poets and musicians, and they certainly gave me a great deal of support and nourishment. But I didn't have a direct path to a spiritual world until I began to discover my own. What I did have, and what I think has made all the difference for me, is I had experiences. I had mystical experiences which led me to be more than clear that the physical world was only the tip of the iceberg. And because I had explored consciousness through the writings of Jane Roberts and the Seth material, I had a clear understanding that consciousness was the foundation of everything. And I had always believed and understood that. And I guess I could have even said at that point that I considered consciousness to be God, or God to be consciousness. I certainly was more likely to think of consciousness as God than to think of some man with a white beard sitting on a cloud somewhere. This gestalt that is the all that is, as we have always called it, source, made sense to me. The all that is exploring itself. So when I began to have truly mystical experiences, which began to shape a whole new understanding for me of the nature of reality and how much we are in control of our experience and of all of what we call this physical reality, I think that gave me a perspective of reverence and awe for nature and for the power of the inner spirit of all life that really changed my perspective. But it took a long time. And it took a lot of experiences compounding over decades before I began to truly grasp what this esoteric journey really is, what this living from the inside out really means. And it was through all of those experiences that I came to the place where I became strong enough and brave enough to really begin to explore my own internal landscape through dreams and channeling and automatic writing and direct experience of the otherworldly. And I suppose if I were to look at that, somewhere along that path, I would say I began my awakening process. But I think I had always been on it. I had always been trying to understand from the inside out who I was, why I was here, and what was happening to me. And I think when we're children, We are all doing that intuitively, instinctively, and naturally if we're allowed to do it. I can remember being a young child and contemplating deeply questions like, why can't people just love each other? Why can't they just be nice to each other? What is it in human beings that drives them into actions that seem abhorrent, that are unfathomable to my little child mind? And I think that's how we all come in. I think we all know those truths so deeply and powerfully as children. And our childhood and adolescence is really the path of having those knocked out of us as hard as possible until we come to the place where we begin to explore them again. And depending how difficult those years are and how much support we get and how strong we are internally and how committed we are internally to our own journey from the beginning, we can get lost for a very long time. Or not. And as I'm watching the young people around me today, 20 and 30 and 40 years younger than I am, I see many of them moving into their own inner journeys much more quickly than I did. I never left my inner journey behind, but I was so busy taking care of everything else in my life that I couldn't give it the time it deserved, and I couldn't give it the attention it needed in order to blossom until much later. Ultimately, though, I think that's the path all of us are on. I actually think it's why we come here in the first place. It's the only reason. We get born on this planet to discover who we are in the larger scheme of the universe, to know ourselves, which leaves us in that other place of contemplation. The unexamined life is a life not worth living, or above all else, to thine own self be true. These are all expressions that are commonly well known in our culture, but no one is listening to them, or they certainly weren't for a very long time. And maybe those are the foundations of what an awakening is. One by one, individually, finding ourselves in the place where we are no longer willing to compromise on what we know is true within us, where what's true within us is calling us so loudly we cannot ignore it anymore. And so our life begins to change, and we begin to explore whole new ways of being. And when I look back at my own life, what I can see very clearly is that those patterns or those experiences of pattern interrupt, where everything changed, where I was confronted by some major shift in the landscape of my life, consistently continued to draw me back to myself. And at some point, once I had made the conscious decision to stay on my own path no matter what, even though there were still bumps in the road, the journey got a lot smoother. And over the decades since then, it has transformed completely. Gradually. but absolutely. Until now, the life that I'm living is the life that I choose to live, that is guided first and foremost by my exploration of spirit, of my gifts, of what I'm here to contribute, and of how I can best serve this planet, this humanity, these members of the community around me and across the globe. It's led me to finding my soul tribe, as we love to call ourselves, and to beginning to understand how powerful we are on a level that I had never even contemplated. It changes everything. But it requires the commitment to go down that lonely road. Because most often, it's the members of our families and those closest to us who are most disquieted by our turning inward and rejecting the outer world as we seek to understand ourselves and to find our place in our own lives.